Welcome to Lore Talks. I'm Elioaux and
And I'm Niniri.
and this is our first episode on the nations of the 6th Astral Era. Today's topic is the early history of Thanalan.
Yeah, so pretty much anything from the beginning of the Sixth Astral Era, possibly a little bit before, up until early Uldah history.
Yes, and as much as some people might think that doesn't encapsulate a whole bunch, they'd be surprised.
Yeah, definitely. We're also going to discuss some other things like basic, the geography of Thanalan in a broad sort of sense.
Yes, and I will be having a video on the geography of Thanalan as well as the other areas of Eorzean and hopefully beyond in the near-ish future. So
Yeah.
that will cover the geographic information more specifically.
Yeah, and I'll be actually putting stuff up on the website. The Western Thanalan one is up now. Well, is being prepared now. That goes into massive detail. It discusses every single thing that you can find in botany there, every single fish, all of the landmarks. So that's sort of like going to be a one-stop shop.
Yeah, it's funny, as much as I play the game, I only just found out about the Amalj'aa and like the actual purpose of it. I'm so used to seeing desert and sort of oil rigs in the real world that I had just assumed they were cerulean miners. But it turns out that the Amalj'aa is actually just for pounding the earth flat for rich people to build houses on.
Yes, yeah. Uldah is a trip.
That's a way of putting it. So, I guess getting off right off the bat, if we go off the tail end of where we were in our previous lore talks, we have the fall of Amdapor, Nim, and Mhach at the end of the 5th Astral Era. And the refugees of two of those nations end up in Garabania, and then I believe the Mhachis, or at least some of the Mhachi refugees, somehow end up in Thanalan.
That's right.
Yeah, can you explain that real quick?
Right, I can. So, like you said, when Mhach falls, the people of Mhach split into different directions. A few of them go on the Void Arc and die. A few of them go up to Garabania, where they escape from the floodwaters. And then there's this third group that might have gone to Garabania, might have gone elsewhere, but eventually leaves wherever they were. They settle on pretty much uninhabited parts of Eorzean, the really remote areas. And while they're there, they just wait out the hatred for mages, because they are the group of sort of heirs of Mhach that refuse to give up black magic, essentially. And they hide away where they can continue to practice this magic. And eventually people stop, killing mages on sight or persecuting them or whatever it was like. We don't know in specifics, but this group then sort of enters the forefront. They stay in a remote area because they go to Thanalan, which doesn't appear to have been massively populated at the time. It's not the most hospitable of areas.
No, especially within Eorzea.
So we have this mixing of sort of context that allows Belah'dia to form. The magical techniques of the Mhachi that these proto-Belah'dians have allows them to somehow, I'm not quite sure how black magic translates to this, but somehow find water sources that are hidden in the desert. Perhaps they were good thaumaturges as well, and they could find it via ley lines or something like that, water ether.
Yeah, it's very possible you could think that if you're an adept magic user, you might be able to track etheric currents, which is an advantage that most peoples would not have within that region.
Right, exactly. And in fact, it's mentioned that this ability to find water sets them apart from the other people in Thanalan or around Eorzean at the time. So they're sort of uniquely suited to finding fresh water, which allows them to survive in Thanalan. Like I said, they flee in civilization, so their move to Thanalan was probably motivated in part by the idea that they wanted to avoid an area where a lot of people were living. Just to avoid any residual anti-mage prejudice.
Yeah, needing to really escape everyone's mass hatred of anyone involved with magic after their causing of the flood that was the Sixth Umbral Calamity.
I was just going to say, so although Belah'dia is sort of formed around 700 of the Sixth Astral Era, well, at least they go into Belah'dia around 700. It takes them a few decades to actually found Belah'dia, but they head into Thanalan around this time. And although that's late into the era's timeline, most of the states hadn't been found. The calamity of water seems to have set them back so severely that you don't really see civilizations popping up for, like I said, 700, 600 years, and in the form of Alamigo, it's like 1,000 years. So they had this space where they could find a place that was uninhabited or unclaimed by a nation and sort of rise out of that.
With that in mind, we know that other nations, such as if you talk about Boja, Dalmasca, and Othard, existed even during the time, though, of the Sixth Emerald Calamity. So how much did the floodwaters affect the rest of the world as we know it? As a quick kind of overview of the legacy of the fallout.
Right. So it's not entirely clear in a lot of the areas how it's affected them. We know, for example, that Dravania and Abathia Spine and Garabania are largely unaffected sort of physically by the floods, although people flee into them as they sort of try to get away from the floodwaters.
Yeah, fleeing to high ground.
Yeah, obviously we know of your fame and the salt maw that rises out of it. Not kind of far away, but not entirely far away from Thanalan. Actually, with Thanalan, we don't really know how the flood affected it specifically. We know that there are a great deal of, in Western Thanalan, for example, cave systems that we find that are entirely flooded. Now that could be natural; it could be from the flood.
Yeah, well, especially within Western Thanalan, places like Nafka as well, and the underwater aquifers that broke free after the Seventh Emerald Calamity.
Right. Do you want to, if we're just going to discuss the geography of Thanalan, is that something you want to do?
Yeah, so actually that is a perfect segue into talking about the topography of Thanalan in general.
Right. So a lot of the fan base thinks of Thanalan as a desert, right? It's actually a pretty diverse place. So
as most deserts are in reality.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. There's a lot of dryland, a lot of sort of rocky terrain. There is desert, obviously, especially in the south and in the center. The west is defined by its coastline. It's got lots of rivers and sort of subterranean springs, like you were talking about, and inlets that hydrate it. It's very fertile.
Yeah, it sits right on the Rotano Sea and right by the the Strait of Merlthor, which is the main connecting body between Vilbrand and Aldenard.
Right, exactly. Which is why it's this huge trade center, and in fact, it's one of the western coastline, which is broader than Western Thanalan represents in game, but the western coastline in general is their main sea access. Because they've got the south, but to the east you've got Pagalthan, obviously, and that's blocked off from them by the Amalj'aa domain.
Yes, and to the southeast you have the Sea of Ash, but that's not super useful.
Yeah, right. It's pretty desolate. So Central Thanalan is a desert. Not a lot of people live there, but it's sort of a crossroads for trade. And the east has been dominated pretty predominantly by the devastation of the calamity, actually, of the most recent calamity, which has spread sort of crystals and destruction all across the area. Very striking views.
Yeah, you can see that most strikingly with the Burning Wall.
Exactly. The Burning Wall is the most iconic example of that. Just a whole section of Eastern Thanalan that's been pretty much destroyed.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look to the south, that's where you see the most, true desertiest section, the technical term, with the Sigoli Desert.
Right, exactly, yeah. So the south is very hostile in the form of the Sigoli Desert. We don't really see much further south than that because I would imagine that Uldah, although they might lay claim to it, don't have a great deal of actual investment in that area because it's so remote, so hostile to life. So Eastern Thanalan, this destroyed area, right? Probably before that, represented sort of a blending between the Badlands of Thanalan and the greenery of the Shroud, because it sort of verges on the Shroud and certain parts of Alamigo that have got this sort of greenery to them.
Yeah, so it very much is kind of like that transition zone that we see between Garabania and the Eastern Shroud.
Yeah, that's what I would imagine parts of it would have looked like. I would have to go back into some 1.0 videos to fully verify that, but to my recollection, that was the implication of the zone back then.
That's the east and that's the west and south, but we also have Northern Thanalan with its ceruleum.
Right. Yes.
Which is fascinating.
So Northern Thanalan is one of the only major sources of ceruleum outside of Ilsabard. It's this rocky area. Ceruleum is, I believe, it's fire aspected material, isn't it? A specific kind of fire aspected material, and of course, it is the major fuel for all machina in the world.
Yeah, it's a part. It can be a gas or a liquid, and its nature is kind of sometimes seems a little bit in flux for the lore. So sometimes it's treated as unaspected, and sometimes it's treated as aspected. So I couldn't say specifically in this case. So that covers some of the general topography. But why don't we look to some of the other civilizations that have existed there, maybe before even Belah'dia, with places like Karn.
Right. So Karn is extremely ancient. It at least predates Belah'dia. It could predate the Sixth Astral Era. We don't know because there's this huge 700-year gap before we know who lived in Thanalan in the Sixth Astral Era. But it's old at least. We know this because the first description you see of the dungeon when you open the dungeon finder tells you that it predates Belah'dia, or at least elements of it do. I'm not entirely sure if this ever represented a civilization. It could be. It could also be a site of sort of pre-urbanized people. We see this in areas in real life that went on to inspire Thanalan, like Göbekli Tepe, which is in Anatolia, which is in Turkey, which was a ritual site that was possibly built by pre-urban peoples. Sort of, they weren't building themselves a town; they were just building this site and then coming back to it as part of their other activities. You could see that as Karn.
It would also make sense when we think about the fact that Karn is at least to some amount dedicated to Azima, and therefore it being a somewhat religious site would kind of fuel that even further.
Yeah, I do have a pet theory that perhaps this is where we see the Aziman worship, is that the Proto-Belah'dians find this site and adopt the faith found within. Because we know that the worship of Azema was transformative to their society, which we'll discuss a little bit later when we discuss black magic. But I also see other inspiration between Karn, like Petra, which,
yes,
like many of these Middle Eastern and North African ruins were reused by other civilizations, like Karn. Petra was built by the Nabateans, an ancient Arabic civilization, but then was revived by the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, similar to the foreign arrival of the Mhachi into Thanalan and then the founding of Belah'dia. Whatever state the Belah'dians find Karn in, they repurpose it. Tetamefu II is the first sultan who does so. We don't know exactly when he reigned, I believe, but either it was a Temple of Azema before, but it certainly was after. They start to sort of repurpose it as this temple. They construct above ground sections at first, and then later in the life of Belah'dia start to build extensions underground. They fill the temple with traps, and then as the nation falls to the War of the Two Sisters, they seal it up. And Karn, just out of interest to anyone who is interested, wasn't just a temple, but it was also a judicial hall, so a court, essentially, aimed at overseeing sort of law and holy law and sort of burial as well. And certain holy relics were stored there.
So after covering Karn, we then actually kind of should go into the main crux and civilization in terms of early Thanalan history that we know of, and that's Belah'dia. And I guess maybe to start with, what it was.
Right. Okay. So Belah'dia seems to have been. We obviously know that it was founded by Mhachi immigrants, or sort of a rump state of the Mhachi. It is the predator to Uldah. Uldah is directly descended from Belah'dia. In fact, its founder was a prince of Belah'dia. It was an extremely prosperous state. It was capable of shows of great military might and great architecture and artistry. And it also seems to at least partially have shared Uldah's passion for sort of globalism and mercantilism and stuff like that.
Okay, so it's a desert civilization that existed in Thanalan and is known for trade and culture. Sounds a lot like Uldah.
It was a lot like Uldah, yes, definitely.
I guess then, where specifically was it?
Right. So, I am of sort of a few minds about this. So we know that Uldah is Ul'dah, the modern city, is on the site of Sil'dih, because they have
Yes.
when the state split into two, Sil'dih and Ul'dah, Ul'dah eventually destroyed Sil'dih, which we'll discuss a bit later, and then eventually, after a while, moved its capital from Old Ul'dah, which I don't believe we see in game, which is a little
Not as far as
disappointing.
I can find.
Right, I've looked as well and I couldn't find it, which I would love to see one day. And then builds it on top of the old ruins of Sil'dih, which causes all sorts of problems for them later. Now, the thinking about why they would do this, first of all, it must be a important site for sort of trade and a good place to put a capital. And I also see this rationale for sort of legitimacy in it. Perhaps Sil'dih retained the old capital of Belah'dia, and then Ul'dah later built on top of that. So it could be exactly where the city of Ul'dah is now. Beyond that, I'm not entirely sure. But their borders seem to have been much the same as Uldah's.
My acting theory, I mean, as much as this sounds oversimplistic, has been a certain amount of just pettiness. Which,
Mhm.
removing an entire civilization, you'd think it wouldn't be like, oh, you wouldn't just be for pettiness. But it does. There's a sense of after the War of the Sisters and all the conflict between the two of them, there is some of it that I can't help but feels a little bit like, take this, you bastards. So the other interesting thing, though, about what we know, I mean, loosely about Belah'dia is that there is, I think, at least one image in 1.0 of Belah'dia off in the desert, but I don't know if that's indicating of where it should have actually been geographically, or if it's just an illusion of what it once was.
Right. And then there's also the question of, is it Belah'dian ruins? You know, we know that Belah'dia had other settlements, many of which are still inhabited today, but perhaps some of which aren't.
Yeah, it just could be, anywhere and everywhere, and in Thanalan.
Yeah, yeah. I would assume I would assume that it's not, far in the Sigori Desert. That doesn't seem particularly practical to me. But
No,
we honestly don't know because it was built atop a water source, specifically a well. Um, but we really do not know much more than that. I would love to explore the ruins of Belah'dia. I'd love to get beneath Ul'dah and explore the ruins of Sil'dih one day. That would be like a dream dungeon for me.
I'd also just love to know where the actual jail of Uldah is, because it's referenced so repeatedly, and yet we actually don't know its location in physical space. I guess we already covered this, but then when was Belah'dia specifically?
So, Belah'dia, the Proto-Belah'dians work their way into Thanalan in about 700, and then about 37 years after that, I think, Belah'dia is founded. It begins as, like I said, a well and a village around it, and then it sort of grows and grows and grows gradually. I would suggest that Belah'dia was probably overwhelmingly Dunesfolk or Proto-Dunesfolk, Lalafell and Midlander Hyors, perhaps with some representation from the Sika Makotes, and maybe the odd outlier. I couldn't imagine that there was a great deal of Rogat in there. I wouldn't imagine that there was many Highlanders at the time. But this would be, commensurate with the state hailing from Mhach, which was overwhelmingly Lalafell and Hyur. But they were starting to open up, starting to get some other groups in it. But there's less time to have migrations in Ul'dah. There's less mercenary hiring. There's less refugee waves. So less diverse than Ul'dah, but with sort of a similar core base.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess building off that sort of when, where, why, how much did the legacy of Mhach affect Belah'dia? And on top of that, how did that then sort of shape Ul'dah? I mean, you can see the legacy, if nothing else, than Black Mage and Black Mage to Thaumaturgy. I mean, it's not obviously a linear one goes to the next, because Thaumaturgy existed in multiple other places, but there's clearly a legacy of magics.
Oh, there definitely is. So just an overview of Mhach for anyone who hasn't watched the Mhach Lore Talk or doesn't know, you should definitely watch the Mhach Lore Talk, by the way. They were a hyper-aggressive imperial power in Eorzean in the 5th Astral Era. They relied heavily on black magic and the summoning of Void Scent, and were in large part responsible for the fall of the civilizations of the Astral Era, including their own. When Mhach was destroyed, obviously, like we said, some of their civilians came to Thanalan eventually and settled there, becoming Belah'dia. The impact of Mhach on Belah'dia, at least, is massive. There are when the Belah'dians settle in Thanalan and start to worship Eorzean, we are told that they alter the sort of the myths and the philosophies and the rationalizations around their black magics and their thaumaturgies to fit the cult of Eorzean. So what we know of now as the magical structure of at least thaumaturgy, possibly black magic, is filtered through this Eorzean lens, but is still intact. So it's definitely a melding of these two traditions, possibly the Quan tradition that predates Belah'dia in part. This could be a reason why Mhachi culture now seems so dilute, this sort of changing of the ways. We also know that Hydaelyn, for example, was founded by these sort of post-Mhachi, pre-proto-Belah'dians when they first come to Thanalan. They find Hydaelyn and name it Hydaelyn, which translates to the land of 1,000 shadows, because obviously Thanalan is extremely hot and the sun is extremely glaring, so you need a place to find shelter when you first arrive there, and that's what Hydaelyn is for them. So we know that they sort of settled there as well.
Well, an interesting note on the name of Hydaelyn is that it is in the ancient tongue of the Lalafell too, not even just telling us what the populace and their racial makeup likely was.
Yeah, if I was to venture a guess, because this period is sort of either pre or during the formation of the common language from the Huron language, I believe. Around that time, Belah'dia contains probably plenty of Hyur, because Mhach had plenty of Hyur, and of course there were various migrations going on, so it would make sense. I would see sort of the ancient Lalafellan language as maybe like a court language, like French in ancient medieval England, or perhaps even a ceremonial language like Latin is in many European cultures.
So you wouldn't necessarily see it as a one-to-one reference to whatever the traditional language of the South Sea Isles was?
Not necessarily. I would assume that perhaps it had its influence, it had its place, like I said. But I would assume that due to the fact that Mhach and Belah'dia are multicultural civilizations, and that, when we speak to Kate'sith, he's not speaking, or Ketchi, he's not speaking ancient Lalafellan, that this extended tongue at least had some place within these societies.
Yeah, that makes sense. It also is worth noting that this is the era from which the Dunes folk arise, as a byproduct of plains folk living in the deserts.
Yes, definitely. So, to discuss a little bit of the cultural touchstones of Belah'dia, to discuss how perhaps the Mhachi might have influenced them. When we go to Khan, we find 4 objects. I'm going to refer to as the 4 pillars. Now, that's my own term, and it's not to be taken as gospel. But the 4 pillars of their society: the Helm of Might, the Gem of Affluence, the Fruit of Knowledge, and the Flame of Magic. Now, the Flame of Magic provides a pretty clear inspiration for this magical tradition that came to define Mhach, and in part defines Belah'dia and Ul'dah, right? They later fused that with the Helm of Might in modern day to become the Flame of Might in modern Uldah heraldry. So you can see that through line from Mhach to Belah'dia to Ul'dah. Ul'dah also took the Gem of Affluence as other symbol, transforming it into the Gem of Prosperity, while Sil'dih adopted the Fruit of Knowledge and transformed it into the Grapes of Knowledge. But as Ul'dah tends to do, it seems like they robbed a little bit of this from Sil'dih as well after killing them, because the Gem of Prosperity in Uldah's heraldry is no longer called the Gem of Prosperity, but the Gem of Wisdom, possibly sort of representing a fusion of the Grapes of Knowledge with the Gem of Prosperity into the Gem of Wisdom.
Doesn't have quite the same ring as the crystal grapes of all-knowing.
Right, exactly. The Grapes of Knowledge, Sil'dih, I'm sorry, I'd love to explore you a bit more. It's not a good name.
Yeah, not one of their greatest feats, as it were.
No. We also see pyramids, or pyramidal-like structures in Belah'dian architecture. Of course, the defining structure of Mhach is a pyramid. The Belah'dian architecture is very ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamia, and sort of ancient Middle Eastern, with these big sandstone blocks. But the pyramids, with the pyramid being in Mhach, and then sort of that pseudo pyramidal structure in Khan, and sort of in other places, other Belah'dian ruins, definitely seems to show another through line through these cultures for me.
Absolutely. I mean, Karn, in a sense, is just a pastiche of the idea of Egypt.
Yeah, definitely.
So that makes total sense.
I mean, if you look at Azema's symbol, particularly how it's depicted in Khan, it's the solar bark, the Ra's boat with the sun on top.
So covering that, is there anything else about their culture sort of worth diving into that we know of?
Right. So, yes, we know that they were a lawful people because of how we see Khan as this judicial center, and that this law was supported or subsumed by their religion. Their clothing, or at least the clothing of officials and holy figures, seems to have been directly inspired by the clothing of the pharaohs and of senior Egyptian officials, as we see in the Arbiter statues in Khan.
There does seem I don't want to say legalism as a focus, but there is a idea of law and order, and we can even see that into the future a little bit with the idea of the importance of scales with Uldah.
Definitely, and we see scales all over Khan, of course, in the Belah'dian parts of Khan. You know, the scales, although they don't seem to have so intrinsically relied on Nald and Thal as their patron gods, they certainly weren't their patron gods. The scale was still a common motif in Belah'dia.
Yeah, absolutely worth noting. So what were Belah'dia's interactions with other nation states at the time, or even what were the other nation states at the time?
Right, so Belah'dia is pretty early, despite being so late in the era, is one pretty early for the Eorzean civilizations to rise. I do believe it crosses over with Gelmora a little bit. It does also cross over with Limsa by a little bit as well. Certainly not Amalj'aa. So we don't know a great deal about their relationships, but we can surmise some things. First of all, Belah'dia was warring pretty frequently, or at least on one occasion in a very significant way, with Huron migrants from Ilsabad and defeated them. This could have caused tensions with the nations that they might have settled in, which would have been Gelmora or the sort of tribal dominions that would later become Amalj'aa. But I can't imagine that they had much relationship with Gelmora. They did, however, have very active relationships with Sharlayan, as they contacted the Sharlayans to build their Aetheryte network, and the Sharlayans trusted them enough to grant this request. Limsa, it is discussed, primarily predated on trade ships going through the strait between them and Uldah directly. So we would have to assume that a lot of these ships were Belah'dian. And so the relationship between the two was probably pretty tense, especially because Limsa didn't actually become a hub for trade in any significant way until over a decade after Belah'dia split.
Yeah, or its early years were still a lot more of piratery and much more cutthroat.
We hear that their first actual market to sell goods in Limsa is a decade after the fall of Belah'dia. So I really can't imagine they would have gotten on in any significant way that was positive. They probably had a lot of battles on the seas.
And everything we know about, I mean, not just that point in history, but the earlier in the Sixth Astral you go, the more things seem to be a little bit rough for everyone.
Definitely, yeah. Rough and also very indistinct, because we don't have... It seems like perhaps we don't have written records in the universe from the first 500 centuries. We can surmise some things, we get told some things, but we know very little about the first few centuries of the Sixth Astral era.
Yeah, and those that we do are almost exclusively carved into actual structures. Like when you look to things like the ziggurat in Girabanya, or
Right.
so almost all information that does exist from that era is literally carved into stone.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so covering most of the stuff about Belah'dia, why did it fall? What exactly happened to tear it in two?
Right. Okay, so we do know that at the end of Belah'dia's life, in the lifetime of the last king or the last few kings, they were under pretty severe financial difficulty. We know this because construction stops entirely on Khan in the reign of Lalafuto IV, who might be the father of the two princes that we're about to discuss, but if not, then was sort of a recent ancestor of theirs.
Yeah, chronology for family trees is not stunningly well kept in Final Fantasy XIV.
No, it's not. Belah'dia is one of the better ones, simply because we know most of the names. We don't know particularly many of the rulers of Alameega, for example. But with Belah'dia, we know them, but we don't really know the order of their succession, outside of a few examples, and that there's massive gaps in it. I'd love to discover like an ancient Egyptian style king list for them with their dates listed at some point. That would be super useful.
The things that me and you despereatly long for,
I know.
I'm sure to most people are the least interest
Yeah.
things possible. But I 100% feel you and crave the same.
So the end of Belah'dia is found in a state typical of a Mhachi successor in their own folly. So it's a sultanate just like Uldah, and it was ruled in its entirety by what we might call the Ul dynasty, the one that now rules Uldah. But I would suggest that the Ul dynasty is better to be seen as a branch of the Belah'dian line, since I think the adoption of the name Ul probably comes from Uldah, comes from the city that they founded.
Yeah. I always presumed that. I guess I never even thought to double check it.
Yeah, we don't have any confirmation, but I would assume we don't know a name for the Belah'dian dynasty. You could consider, because it's the Ul and the Seal dynasties, you could consider it the Belah dynasty or the Bel dynasty.
Everything about their culture, everything about Sil'dih and Ul'dah is rooted in their building of a new legacy taken from what came before. So I think that makes absolute sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are sort of to take a look at the time that we're talking about here. It's about the late 10th century of the successful era, and there are two sons of the Sultan. The Sultan's very ill, and these two sons start to quarrel. They were, what were their names again? They were Sisigan and...
I knew Sisigan. I don't know the other one. So
this is the plight of Sil'dih. See, they're so niche. But either way, these two siblings begin to argue over the throne, and sort of posture themselves. And even before their father dies, they're fighting. I think it's about 5 years before their father's passed away, when he's ill. They're already starting to sort of war against each other. This war is intense enough that the Sharlayans stop building aetherites in Thanalan for a while, because they're, pacifists. So they very...
don't want any part of what's
Right.
going on in Eorzean whenever stuff's going down.
In fact, I think it's mentioned that one of the siblings uses the aetherites to position their troops, which is what gets the Sharlayans to pull out, because they say, we're not creating weapons of war for you.
Yes, which ends up going quite wrong later on.
It does.
With moving of troops through aetherites, because let's just say bad things happen when you destroy an aetherite while people are using it in transit.
Really, really bad things. Aetherites are kind of scary, actually.
Yeah. I mean, you're literally turning yourself into energy and moving yourself through space.
So, that's right. I remembered the other child's name now. It's Sasawefu. So, Sasawefu and Sisigan. Sasawefu is the one, I believe, who uses the aetherites to attack Sasigan. And in retaliation, Sasigan's army, like you said, destroys one of the aetherites while it's being used, which kills, or God knows what it does, to 800 troops in the Sil'dih camp.
The optimistic version is that they essentially just had their aether become one with the ethereal sea over time, and they didn't experience anything.
Yes.
They just basically died in their sleep, functionally.
Right. The less optimistic one is perhaps that they just appeared in solid rock or in the skies, because gods only know.
If we look at how flow functions, my hope is that I'm right.
Yes, I think it's entirely plausible, but either way, it was really, really very bad. So it's only, and this is all happening before the father dies, so before they've even technically had a chance to ascend to the throne.
Merely tensions rising.
Right. But he does die, and in 969...
yes. An auspicious year.
Yes. Nice. Belah'dia splits in two. Sasawefu founds Sil'dih, Sasigan founds Ul'dah. And Sasagan at this point also founds the Sultan Sworn, the Paladins that we know of.
Which becomes very, very interesting in their legacy both for the following years, even onto modern Uldah, and the way in which the Paladin may have arisen out of that legacy, but is not singularly beholden to only being a Sultan Sworn.
Right. So that's exactly right. And in fact, it's mentioned, I believe, that the early members of the Sultan Sworn of the Paladins were particularly powerful warriors who fought in the Civil War, who were then granted this rank as sort of a gift and out of a symbol of trust, perhaps.
Yes, and they were also granted. The three leaders were granted swords hewn from the same block of, well, some kind of stone.
Yeah, so the three elites were, and then a fourth was given Oathkeeper.
Yes.
The leader was given Oathkeeper, then the three elites were given Cortana, Dorandal, and a different sword whose name I've forgotten.
I have utterly forgotten that one too. You're beating me in the name remembering department today. Oh, and just as a quick distinction, when we say warriors, we mean like mercenaries /
Yes.
fighters, not necessarily the job warrior, just because that is somewhat of an important distinction.
Yes, it is. So we're just discussing soldiers and combatants. They were probably gladiators in the game sense, but gladiators or lancers or archers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But obviously not members of those organizations. Again.
Yeah. So then, I guess now with the rise of Sil'dih and Ul'dah, what is Sil'dih and what is Ul'dah?
Right. So Sil'dih and Ul'dah, I would imagine they both look somewhat similar to how we would understand Ul'dah. They both come from very similar situations. Sil'dih and Ul'dah found their own sort of separate capital cities. Like we said, Ul'dah, we don't know where old Ul'dah is, unfortunately. But Sil'dih is where we see Ul'dah now.
Yeah, and we can guess that they're probably, like you say, remarkably similar to what they are now, even in, if not exact buildings, even stylings, we can assume are probably pretty similar. If we look at the ruins of Sil'dih and the modern Ul'dah.
Yeah. So Ul'dah continues to fight against Sil'dih. Well, it's not fair to sort of single Ul'dah out there. They continue to fight each other. They're both at fault here. And Ul'dah goes on to actually hire a lot of Roegadyn Highlanders, presumably from Girabania, who then sort of begin that diaspora in Ul'dah. The reason that we see Roegadyn there now is probably because of this. But they just continue to fight against each other. Ul'dah. One thing that I would say probably distinguishes Sil'dih from Ul'dah is that Ul'dah is probably the one that had the gladiatorial system, because we know that they founded that post Belah'dia. So Sil'dih probably didn't have the blood sands and all of that, and the gladiatorial culture.
Yes. Yes.
So around the beginning of around the middle point actually of the 12th century, we see an individual named Lalawefu of the Sil dynasty take the throne in Sil'dih, and he starts to take Sil'dih in a direction that makes it much more powerful than Ul'dah. He levies taxes in a very clever way, and Sil'dih becomes very rich. He also manages to secure a bunch of water sources and is named the King of the Springs for sort of securing this water. He then steals Ul'dah's water source, or at least taps into it as well, which deprives Ul'dah of a good chunk of it, which Ul'dah had sort of been in that phase, sort of in a cold war against Sil'dih, but obviously they cannot take this insult and this threat to their existence. So Ul'dah kicks back into the war against them. And the Sultan of Ul'dah does a number of things to sort of take this through. First of all, they hire some more mercenaries, which is fine. More unfortunately, they get a bunch of thaumaturges to create a poison or a weapon named a Trader's Spurn, which is sort of an alchemical magical concoction, a mixture of the two, that when it comes into contact with a dead body, reanimates the corpse. Obviously, not the most ethical of weapons, one might say. Very Mhachi, actually. I'm sure they'd be very proud.
Yeah. Definitely following in the history of their progenitors, that's for sure.
Yes.
when we look at the Traitor's Spurn, there is something interesting about how its effects do seem reminiscent of some of the creatures that we find within places like Karn. And whether or not that's accidental or not is something I've always wondered about.
Yes. So this is why when I was just a wee baby getting into Final Fantasy XIV and not with a clear understanding of the lore, I used to think Karn was the capital of Sil'dih. Obviously, that's not the case. But there is a link there. Now, I personally think that the corpses in Karn are intentionally sort of and ceremonially brought back as guardians by the Belah'dian separately of this. But it's impossible to ignore the parallels. And in fact, maybe these rituals are what the Uldah alchemists and thaumaturges used as a basis for the Traitor's Spurn.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that the entire history of the Traitor's Spurn is shrouded in misinformation, by Uldah's hand.
Specifically, yes. So the Uldahs managed to defeat the Sil'dih in a number of battles and push them back to their city. They're under siege. They've not won the war, and there's no guarantee that they'll succeed in this siege, right? But they have them cornered. They're at the lead right now, and there's a lot of dead in the Sil'dih capital city because the Uldahs pushed them back into it by battle. And of course, the Sil'dih wanted to take as many dead as they could. Also, there is a starvation sort of epidemic going on because they're starving them out. And there's just generally a lot of dead bodies. And the Sultan loads up a bunch of, I believe that we're given to understand sort of like big pots of Traitor's Spurn inside catapults and fires them into Sil'dih, which promptly causes all of the corpses in the city to rise and to start to kill everyone, which causes more corpses to rise, and Sil'dih collapses, is just destroyed in a very, very short period of time. And then the Uldah army is able to sort of destroy a number of these corpses and seal up the city for a while before they come back and eventually build on it in a few generations.
What an idea! You not only create a giant corpse party brigade of your enemies and lock them away, but then build your own city on top of that without ever actually dealing with the problem.
Yes. Yeah. It is a spectacularly silly decision, and I'm sure that we will discuss later that it does come back to bite them in the arse. Now,
that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Now, the Sultan hides this because even as sort of amoral as he may be, he understands that this is a horrifying thing that he's done by pretty much anybody's metric.
Even on a pragmatic level, he could just be worried that people would turn against him once they find out the truth. Right. Foreshadowing.
Yes. Now, as you've discussed in a recent video, the Sultan at the time was a man called Sasagan Ul-Sisigan, Sultan of Uldah. He declared that the Sil'dihs had done this plague, that they'd created this plague in an attempt to create all these zombies and open the gates and sacrifice Sil'dih to also destroy Uldah. He'd come up with this as he was purging the city, and he said the reason that we're leading our army into it is to purge the sin of the Sil'dihs. It's a very, very cruel thing to lie about, obviously, amongst also a cruel thing to do in the first place. But he understood that if his citizens ever found out about this, then he would be condemned. So he tried to hide it. But it's a secret far too large to really ever effectively hide. And a Huron noble of the city named Balduff Thorn found out. Balduff is a passionate man and a powerful man, and he's immediately enraged by this. He goes to the court and condemns the Sultan publicly. The Sultan actually declares that he should be executed for this, but all of the guards and the courtiers are so horrified by what he's done that they refuse his orders and seize him, imprisoning him in Uldah's deepest prisons for the rest of his life.
And that has repercussions that become long-lasting into the future. If nothing else, I would recommend remembering the name Thorn, because as a character in Thanalan history, he is tied to a lot of events that, despite his legacy being only roughly 200 years long, despite being only one guy, his legacy ends up having a much far-ranging impact and is tied to a lot of stories, including those of places like Copperbell.
Yeah, definitely Copperbell, and the Little Ladies Day, I believe, is also
Yes.
Thorn Dynasty have brought up plenty in it. I think the most astounding thing about the Thorn Dynasty's legacy is how it comes to an end. The selfless nature of it. We'll discuss that a little later in the Uldah video, or the modern Thanalan history video. But the Thorn Dynasty, for the time being, takes the throne and makes it clear, Baldurf at least, makes it clear that he does not intend to rule, his family does not intend to rule permanently, but until the Uld dynasty is ready to retake the throne in a sort of more moral manner.
Yeah, it's well, despite however you want to talk about, historical revisionism, it reminds you of the sort of relinquishing of power of someone like Washington.
Yeah.
And whether self-serving or not, tendency towards sincere nobility.
Definitely, and of his descendants as well. It doesn't seem like they tried to hold on to power too long. I mean, again, we'll discuss the exact time frame and how that happened later on. And also, there are some modern Thorn descendants in Uldah that we meet, again, through the Little Ladies' Day event. And they're actually still close to the Old Dynasty.
Yeah. So, all's well that ends well, starts well. Well.
Yeah. Well, unless you're a Sil'dih.
Unless you're, or a Belah'dian, or a Mhachi.
Yeah.
Well.
Most people in Eorzean.
Yeah. So we've talked about, some of the key players on the stage of Thanalan when it comes to the more playable races, but we have sort of neglected to talk about the Amalj'aa and their tie to Thanalan, its history, and their extreme importance to the region.
Yeah, absolutely. The Amalj'aa are the oldest group in Thanalan that we know of, first of all. They are nomadic. They live pastoral lives, mostly on the plains of Pagalthan, but they do bleach out into Thanalan, specifically parts of southern Thanalan. They are a warlike people. They're trained in combat from a young age, but it's not like they're going around warring with people out of their own will. They go to war with Uldah and with Belah'dia, because they did also war with Belah'dia, because of their policy of claiming a place called Zanrak. Now, the Amalj'aa origin myth states that they were created out of unintelligent reptiles back in sort of the ancient times of the world by Ifrit, in Zanrak, which is this place that we see in southern Thanalan. It means land of indomitability, I believe, in the Amalj'aa language. And Belah'dia and Uldah both try to claim the area. I'm not 100% sure why. It doesn't seem rich or fertile, but they try to.
I mean, if there's a history of anything when it comes to their people, it does seem to be claiming lands for any potential gain.
Yes. Yeah. But this causes obviously hostility between them and the Amalj'aa, and they've been warring sort of ever since that period. The Amalj'aa obviously wanted to conduct pilgrimages to it, because they consider it their land. And yeah, you can go and see that in southern Thanalan now. It's where you see most of the Amalj'aa. It's where the Amalj'aa Beast Tribe quests take place, stuff like that.
Yeah, and a really important distinction I'll point out too that you alluded to earlier is that they might be a warrior people, but they're not necessarily militaristic. And so we see through the Amalj'aa quest line what their people are, I don't want to say supposed to be like, but what their idea of what they're supposed to be like is. Because the other thing is that many that we're contending with are also tempered, and therefore not great representations of their people. In the same way that judging Sahagin or the Sylph, right, by the sort of the tempered Sylph would be a poor understanding.
To not discuss them not discuss it in too much detail to avert a spoiler, just in case anyone's watching it without having played the last two expansions. We do see other groups of Amalj'aa beyond the ones that we meet in the Beast Tribe quest that are, proud but not warlike. They're trained in combat, that they are combative people, but they're not a warlike people necessarily, unless threatened.
Yeah, a great example, I think, of the propensity of what most Beast Tribes are actually like would be the quest you get once you finish all the A Realm Reborn beast tribes.
Mm.
You get a quest of them sort of working together, and I think that does a good job of explaining what everyone is supposed to be like when they're not dealing with gods that are driving them mad.
Right. Yeah. Another thing I'd love to discuss is a side quest that I know you enjoy very much: the greatest story never told.
Yes. What a good yes. Both tying together past and present. So
Right.
please go ahead.
The side quest tells the story of a treasure hunter who's trying to find the legacy of a sultan called Lalafuto III. Lalafuto is one of the sort of the middling sort of period sultans of Belah'dia. He was around when there was still money to build in Khan, and he actually hid away a treasure of several 100 million gil, or at least that's what the tales tell. And this treasure hunter called Valiant Heart wants to find it. So we follow him through a bunch of riddles and a bunch of tasks to find details of his affair with his paramour, so his consort. So the Belah'dian sultans had a sultana or a sultan, a royal consort, and then they had paramours and mistresses, just like many dynasties did in real life. However, he was a little bit more fixated on his paramour and was planning to flee Belah'dia to live a peaceful life with her. Now, it's unclear if he managed to do so, or if his wife, who is deceptively named Mimita the Meek, assassinated him for this attempt. But either way, she went on to rule the Sultanate. She became the ruler of the Sultanate for many years afterwards. Now, I would suggest that she probably assassinated him because her section of Khan is hidden behind illusory walls, Dark Souls style. So you don't need to do that unless you're doing some sneaky stuff.
Yes, and if you're being described as meek, at least in 14, that typically is something you're seeking as a descriptor
Yes.
to hide your actual capabilities.
Yes, so that's the main lore impact of it, but in a really, really cute way. We find this tablet that is actually the treasure. It's not hundreds of millions of gil. It's a tablet with lines upon lines of love poems for his lover. I mean, the treasure hunter at the time is somewhat offended, but if we were to discover in real life a record of that of like a Byzantine emperor who we didn't know much about or met a mysterious end, then that would be fabulously valuable. So.
Yeah, I may be misremembering this, but doesn't the text for that quest doesn't he allude to in his like hints about the location of thing is that it is as valuable as like a bunch of gil or something, but it's not that it's actually valuable. It's just that it's worthwhile to him, worthwhile to the
it's sappy poetry. It's cute. It's really cute.
I remember finishing that quest for the first time during A Realm Reborn and also feeling like really let down. And yet that was like that must have been like 3 years ago. And now I think back on it and I'm like, no, this is amazing. This lore is this. I would much rather have this than like 50 million gold.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I love anything that I can find out about the historical details, including the mundane details of Eorzean history. So it's really cool to me.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm sure there's got to be a lot of other topics that are sort of not extraneous because they're very much tied to these things, but are really important at the same time. So why don't we go over some of those things like that? Like I know you wanted to talk about the gods of Thanalan.
Yeah, I definitely did. So Thanalan has 3 major gods through its history that we know of. I mean, the rest of the 12 are worshipped in Thanalan, even in the modern day, but there are 3 main ones. So the first one is Ifrit, who is the god of the Amalj'aa, obviously. He created them, so they say, out of great lizards, and transformed them into a tribe of 14 men, 7 men, 7 women, who went on to found the 7 tribes of the Amalj'aa, which is not something we get discussed a lot, but I'd love to see individual tribes and how they differ. This was, of course, in Zamorak. The modern gods of Uldah are Nald and Thal, who together, under the conjoined name Nald-Thal, represent the underworld and commerce, and individually represent life and death. He's a fire god, and his symbol is the cowrie shell, which is a shell that was used in real life as a currency for many millennia. His relevance to Uldah is pretty clear, right? You know, it's a trading city with a trade god on top of it. Azema, however, like we mentioned, the goddess of Belah'dia, is a sun god. She's the goddess of inquiry, which probably makes her the goddess of Hildebrand.
That was a connection I was not prepared for. But
I
yeah,
know.
no, that's
I made that writing notes for this. But they go on, of course. These Azema retains her importance because, to a lesser degree, she's still worshipped, and the Seekers of the Sun tribes in Thanalan, of course, choose her as their patron because the Seekers of the Sun do. But Nalthal sort of rises to the top. We don't know how, and I would love to know how that process occurred, but we don't know right now.
It is worth noting too that the stones for both of them are in Thanalan. Azema's is
Definitely.
by the Burning Wall, and I believe Naldhal's is in the Thaumaturgus Guild.
It is, yeah, because that's where we see Thancred and
Sacred praying in the Realm Reborn trailer.
Yes.
Oh, and that reminds me, with Karn and I mean, frankly, with all of the civilizations of Thanalan, well, not as much with the Amalj'aa, but the art of making soulkin seems to pop up a bunch. I know you refer to it as Golomancy, so why don't you talk a little bit about that real quick?
Right. So, like you said, Golomancy is my own term, so I don't claim any canonicity of that. But the Belah'dians seem to use Golomancy very heavily, like really, really heavily. In fact, seems to have been crucial to their state, or at least to their religious affairs. Based on the tombstone in the Weeping City, which you pointed out to me actually the other day. It is plausibly finds its roots in the Golomancy of Mhach, which it was not known for. But at the close of the War of the Magi, certain Mhachi began to copy elements of Amdapori Golomancy for themselves, to sort of take the weapons of their enemies. In terms of Belah'dia, we see that these works were really crude stone creations in early Belah'dia, like the simple golems and like the arbiters that we find in Karn Normal. But later ones are gorgeously decorated, really sophisticated statues of sort of embossed stone and precious metal, like the final boss of Karn Hard. We don't know what exactly happened with Uldah, because Uldah does still make Soulkin, right? They still make the mammoths, but they seem much less dominant in society, and they're not used for martial affairs. So I like with Nalthal taking over from Azema, I would love to see how this transition sort of manifested itself, and why these were lost or changed. It could be that the War of the Sisters destroyed the knowledge for them, that they simply fell out of favor.
I was just about to speculate the same thing about the War of the Sisters. The other interesting thing to note is that, going back to Copperbell, the fact that they would bother to enslave the Hekaton Kyries rather than just creating Soulkin is...
Yes.
I'm not sure what to make of that.
Yes, yeah. And I actually wonder if that's perhaps it. I wonder if dethroning the old dynasty perhaps went along with this somehow, because it was the Thorns, of course, that enslaved or bought the already enslaved Hekaton Kyries from the Gigants and put them to work in the mines. So it could be that transition. That there's a thousand things that it could be that we could speculate about, which is all the fun of this game.
Yes, absolutely. And just as an acknowledgement of a comment or two I think I saw elsewhere, just because the answer in a developer sense is, well, they didn't think about it, so they just didn't, because the developers missed something, is not interesting. So
no.
Forgive me if that's not, if I just take the text at hand and work with what we have.
Yeah, and everything is explainable in this game. They give us the tools to explain it, even if it is developer fiat. The hardest one, I think, was the Ultima weapon prototype in the Shadows of Mhach raid series. Yeah, in Dunscaith. Yeah. But even then, we've managed to find a rationale for that.
Yeah.
So go watch our Mhach Lore Talk if you want to discover that.
Absolutely. And the thing I'll say, too, on that sort of final note on that topic, though, is there is very little to anything that I can think of that actively breaks anything, and that can't be pretty easily, with some small amount of effort, explained in an interesting way.
Yeah, nothing that I found, at least.
Well, I guess that about does it for today. I mean, we did a good job sort of covering. Well, I did a good job. You did a good job covering the primarily sort of early days of Thanalan and giving the listeners sort of a bedrock for understanding the nation state that I love so much of Uldah.
Yeah, I mean, I love Uldah as well. It may not be my favorite, that might be Limsa, but I definitely love Uldah. And I wouldn't be able to do this in any way that was remotely organized or coherent without you to prompt me and to bounce off. And plus, you make plenty of sort of additions of your own as well.
Yes, it's I'm very used to being the one who waxes abundant, so it's actually very interesting being on the other end of that process.
Yeah. So our next video in this specific series of lore talks will be modern Thanalan, but we're probably going to be releasing an End Talkers before that, right?
Yes, we will probably be releasing this, then an End Talkers or two. It depends on what our next recording session for End Talkers is, because our first one ended up being broken into 3 parts.
Yes.
We'll find out.
Yeah, this one may also be, I don't know, 8 hours long, but you said you like long form content, so we like to give the people what they like.
Yes, very much so, and I am not opposed to it. It is a very invigorating long form conversation.
Yeah, I love doing End Talkers. I also love doing other lore talks, though. It's the best way to learn this lore is to present it to you in this form.
Absolutely. There's something where when you have to deep dive it well enough to explain it to someone, it sticks in your mind a hell of a lot better.
Definitely. So keep an eye out for Elio's video on the channel about Thanalan geography. Keep an eye out for the article on Western Thanalan that'll be going up at some point. It's turning into a vast affair, so it might be a while away, but
well, I mean, nothing better than sitting there and deep diving into a text document, so you provide for us all.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, so with that all done, I've been Elioux Forcheron.
I've been Niniri.
Lovely having you all, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. Let us know how you felt about the video in the comments below.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye.
Bye.
This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday. And comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.